Hi everyone, welcome to Itsy Bitsy's live read from Hidden Tracks by Zoe Lee. Chapter 1, Seth. Seth stood at the windows in his attic studio, curtains pushed apart to watch a lightning storm flash and sizzle over the treetops of the forest preserved north of his house. The power had finally died after blimping in and out. If there was thunder, it wasn't audible with the windows closed. Silence was not a state his mind was in very often, so every subtle groan of the three-story house he had grown up in was like a vibrato note sung by a baritone. Every scritch of the maple and red cedar trees crowding the house was like a screech when sliding up an acoustic guitar's strings. Every beat of his heart was like a kick drum. Loneliness seeped into the near quiet that he had usually filled with music. He'd known today would be rough, that he wouldn't sleep tonight, because it was Hedda's birthday. No, because it would have been Hedda's birthday today. Their best and worst times were a vortex of joy, pain, and grief, making him nauseated and clammy. On the past would have been birthdays. He had reminisced that he was Hilda's from the minute they met, lusting after each other's creativity as much as each other's bodies. For years, they'd been romantic partners in a musical duo that wrote and performed, ate and sweated, made love and had threesomes and more sums, and traveled the world together. They had done it all together from 18 until 6 months before her death, when she'd left him. He had been reeling from the breakup, feeling like nothing worked without her, when her death slammed him sideways. From that moment on, he had been someone else. That was why, on the past would have been birthdays, he thought about how good his life was, even if it wasn't what he imagined they would have forever. He just took some time to appreciate the simplicity of the small-town life here in Mayville County. But today, for the first time, he was angry with Hilda for walking away from what they had after refusing to explain it further than a satat. It isn't what I want anymore for me or for you. What had she wanted that he hadn't been giving her, and how could she have believed that he wouldn't have given her anything she wanted? What had she wanted for him that she had thought them being together personally and professionally was preventing? He dug his fingers into the muscle over his heart. With a jolt of fury at his melancholy, he slammed through the house until he was outside. He shook his wayward curls back and settled his noise-canceling headphones on like a headband, turning on a playlist of angry punk rock songs as he started walking. "Don't be like this, Seth." He could hear her tiss with her customary German accent, a matter-of-fact yet rambling manifesto she proclaimed on Ibiza, the ecstasy kicking in or wearing off. Life isn't boring, so life is good, yeah? Seasons change, your world expands and then contracts. You fall in love and go new places, and return to favorite places. You write a song and you play piano, and you fuck an interesting person, and you eat empanadas and you drive a boat. There are wars or there are orgies, and bad politicians are re-elected, and inspirational people die of broken hearts, and the whole thing stops and starts and repeats indefinitely in infinity, and you can hear the melody, and you're alive, I'm alive, we're all alive, and you're moving, I'm moving. So how can it be a bad life? "I'm moving," he muttered. It was true in a literal sense. He was tromping alongside the train tracks now. But he had a flicker of doubt whether Hedda would agree that he was moving metaphorically, though. There was an itch in his throat, a sudden urge to open it and sing out. Although he was on a stretch of Apple Road that was a strung-out, drunken row of industrial buildings, sound would carry to nearby houses if he just stood there and sang. So he studied the buildings, a hangar, an old shipping depot which was nothing but a sheet metal hangover, and the original bottling factory for orchards. He scuttled down the embankment and angled across the overgrown field until he was in the factory's parking lot, the asphalt spider-webbed and sprouting weeds. He took out his cell and used its flashlight, circling the factory cautiously until he found the service bay door unlocked. He pulled it up and climbed in, sending the light in arcs all over. And then there was too much crawling under his skin, so he tugged off his headphones and belted out one of Hilda's very favorite songs, Adele's Rolling in the Deep. Of course, the acoustics were perfect. With slow, unrevelating power and control, he took in a breath until his lungs were totally expanded, his ribs dilated against the surface of his skin. Joy at the feeling pricked, and he sang another of her songs, Florence, plus the Machine's cover of You've Got the Love. It had been so long since he used the full strength of his lungs and vocal cords, so long since he'd used the full measure of his skills as a singer. It was exhilarating. He kept going, belting out a melody of her favorite songs until he thoughtlessly began to sing one that they had written together in the early years while they were still at Juilliard. Grief buckled his legs and he hit the concrete, face dropping until his forehead cracked against his knees. He hunched there, eyes wet, until he could move again. He ran home, breath seesawing because he was emotional, not because he was out of shape. Stripping right there in the kitchen, he filled a large mason jar with water and took it with him into the bathroom, putting it on the windowsill while he showered. Once he sloshed off the sweat and tears, he turned off the water and collapsed on his stomach on his bed, where he kept grieving until he dropped off into an exhausted sleep. Chapter 2. Seth. Seth was slumped in a chair at the gate at the New Orleans airport, his head on the top edge, the thin strap of fake leather bowing with the weight of his skull like a hammock. His memories of the week he'd spent here for the voodoo special were like a wrinkled white t-shirt that had been twisted up haphazardly before being dyed. Bright spreads of color that overlapped, bled together, displayed the joy and connectedness of performing with 3 jazz bands and catching up with old friends over Cajun food and dancing. The patches were all the dyes blended together into murky dark brown like a radiant of fear, like there'd been for years before he went on stage or right after he came off stage. And there were white spaces where no dye saturated the shirt, moments of solitude or quiet contentment when he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Since he only did 1 or 2 bigger gigs like this per year, he was rough around the edges today, drained, his mind sluggish and overtired. So he heaved himself up, slung his bag over one shoulder, and headed down the terminal until he found a coffee kiosk. While waiting in a long line, he idly wondered how many weeks, if not months, he'd spent in airports and train stations, arriving, departing, and connecting from place to place. He ordered his coffee and shuffled like a zombie to the other end of the counter to wait. "Seth!" one of the baristas called. He took his drink with a grateful smile and shuffled just far enough away to allow the next person to get their order before taking the first sip. So hot it nearly burned his tongue. "Seth!" someone called. "I already got my coffee," he called back without looking up at the baristas. "I can see that," the person helped from right behind him now. Seth raised his head sharply to find a beast of a man with a bleached, undercut grinning at him, all neon white teeth, keen-eyed sharp. He blinked a few times in complete surprise, grunting when his former bandmate thunked into him. "Hey, kid," Trentum said, hugging him. "Fancy meeting you here." They were stepped apart and Trentum shook his head before he pointed at the tables in the food court. "Come sit," he invited in his mellow, commanding way. "Unless your flight's boarding soon." No, I have an hour. Let's go sit," Seth agreed, trailing Trentum to an empty table near the wall. They fell into opposite seats. Trentum's legs sprawled wide, and Seth stretched out under Trentum's chair with the ease of long familiarity. Seth had joined Downbeat shortly after Hedda's death and played with them for 2 years, but he realized with a pang he'd done a shitty job of keeping in touch. "I didn't know y'all were in town," he apologized. "I didn't miss a show of yours while I was here, did I?" "We're running Reagan on a 20-city tour," Trentum explained with a happy sigh. For years, Seth hadn't had a home, just a backpack, a guitar case, and a few storage units. It had been exhilarating and life-affirming. He loved nearly every minute of it. By the time he'd come back to Maybelle and asked his brother and sister if he could move back in with them, he knew he was tired, ready to lay his head down on the flattened pillow on his childhood bed and melt into the soft mattress until he revelated. So the idea of a 20-city tour had him shaking his head and saying with some ease, self-depreciation, "Meanwhile, my 1-week trip here is running me ragged. We came here just to hang out and chill. Don't know how we missed you, though." Seth took another sip of coffee. "I was just sitting in with a few jazz bands." Seth was worried that Trentum would say something way too serious for an airport food court, but after a careful breath, Trentum nodded and deliberately leaned back. "You still running your family's restaurant with your brother and sister, then?" "Uh-huh," Seth confirmed almost gratefully. "They moved out, though. My brother's got a serious girlfriend. My sister got married. It's good my parents retired out west and don't seem to be concerned with any of us, or I'd be afraid that they'd play matchmaker." "Still single, like you were before?" "Not like before," Seth said, rolling his eyes. "Now I can't sleep in unfamiliar beds. But I do it a few times a year to travel for things like this, to play with friends. It's good to go home, though, to my extremely expensive bed and the routine of living alone." "Guess we ain't 22 and unstoppable idiots now," Trentum laughed. Amusement flowed through Seth, his eyes crinkling. "You're responsible. Boring." Scowling good-naturedly, Trentum shoved Seth's leg slightly with his knee. "Shut up, kid," he grumbled. "You'll ruin our reputation before we're even done making one." "Y'all seem good." "We're all doing good," Trentum assured him, leaning over to steal some of Seth's coffee. Seth knew it was an understatement. Downbeat was going full tilt toward stardom if they could keep up the momentum. "Montrose got a couple more kids now, and they're with us some of the time. So that changed the whole dynamic, you know." "You're going to be unstoppable soon," Seth murmured. Trentum snorted, just as terrible at taking a compliment as Seth, and rambled on about how many stops they had to go on the North American leg of the tour. These stories had once been Seth's life, too, when he was a full-time musician and songwriter. Hearing the tiny hitches in the rhythm of Trentum's voice, of words when he had to take a quick detour to explain who a new person was, picked at Seth. But it had taken him years and Mabel to get to a place where he could do something like that, like the Voodoo Festival. He knew that Trentum and the others didn't begrudge Seth his regained equilibrium, even with his creative output, had more tenderous anxiety and tenderness than before. Just like Seth, he didn't begrudge them that they were about to kaput up to a height he hadn't reached. He drank his coffee and listened until he couldn't wait another minute if he wanted to use the restroom and board with his group. "It's time for me to get to my gate," he sighed. "Oh," Trentum said, shaking his head and lumbering to his feet. They hugged again, a little fiercer and longer than the first one, and then Trentum scratched his blonde stubble before blurting, "Listen, we'll be in Chicago for Pitchfork, and we're getting in a few extra guys. Jin's been messing around with things to see how it'll work, so I think you should come." Too much had nearly tripped him up when he was with Downbeat, and the separate songs had been melded together into a mashup. He couldn't be sure where one song had ended and the next began, so he was afraid. even though he knew it was irrational. And if he traveled too much, he would be sad and his creativity would start to shrivel up again. Thank you for listening to this portion.